How are we doing? If you hear this early, while we're waiting a little bit to make sure the live stream is running, you are blessed. And you're going to have a great little bit of humor in today's class. It's an old joke that I just love. And we'll be telling that one right after we establish the first Mishnah that we're going to be talking about. All right, let me check that our stream has engaged. Yeah, good on Facebook. And are we good on Facebook? Believe we are. Yes, we are. Beautiful. Who's with us? Bryna Bloomfield is with us. Welcome. Yehudit Sobel says Shamim? Shalom, right? From Florence, South Carolina. James Roth from Indianapolis. Stephen Geger from Dover, New Hampshire. Christo Cheney says, happy birthday, Sal. Thank you, Christo. This is my solar birthday today. Last week was my Hebrew birthday. This was actually a gift from Nina. I love it. We've had a great day so far. I wanted to create a family memory for my birthday. And, so rather than just go play golf or laze around, we had a beautiful opportunity set up for us by my friend Yossi Segelman from Our Big Kitchen. And he gave us 25 care packages with healthy snacks that my family and I were able to deliver to some frontline responders around LA, and they were so happy to get it. We had an especially nice encounter at the LAPD Metro Division, which, they've had a lot of, adversity in recent weeks. And the police stations are really locked down tight. And, we were outside with our packages and they questioned us quite thoroughly to find out what it is that we wanted. And we said, we just want to say thank you for your service, and we're delivering these care packages. And then they let us in. And, they were really emotional. And the captain himself, Captain Valenzuela, came down to see us. And it was just so nice to be able to support people who put their lives on the line every day to keep us safe. Okay, Ed Berg is in the house from Galloway, New Jersey. Sharon says, Yom Huledet Sameach. Thank you, Sharon. Carolyn Chavez says, happy birthday. Melissa Itel-Jurin says, happy birthday. Thank you so much. Stephanie Frieden and Tatiana Karina, thank you so much for your warm wishes. All right. Thank you, Robert Clemens and Owen. You guys are great. It's so fun, so beautiful that we have this learning community together. All right, we've got a busy daf today. We are holding by daf Kuf Beis. That's 102 of Tractate Shabbos. We're going to wrap up chapter 11 with the final Mishnah, number 7, and start chapter 12 with its first Mishnah. And we're finally going to move on from the definitions and explorations and nuances of the forbidden labor on Shabbos of carrying. We're going to move into some other prohibited labors of Shabbos. All right, Mishnah number 7. We've been talking about what happens in terms of carrying or throwing, right? So to be liable for violating the Torah prohibition of carrying or throwing on Shabbos, 3 elements. Take from a place, transfer it either by carrying or throwing, and then place it in another domain, or if it's all in the public domain, take it, throw it or carry it more than 4 cubits, and then place it in the public domain. And so we asked, well, what if the taking or the placing is onto something that is not stable, like the example of the nut onto water? Now we're going to talk about what if one's intention is not stable? What if you change your mind? Or what if you remember, right? Remember that all these liabilities to bring the sin offering for violating Shabbos are if you violate Shabbos unwittingly, because you forgot it was Shabbos, or you didn't know that it was prohibited to do this particular labor on Shabbos, for example. So if you do it intentionally, if you know it's Shabbos and you know you're not allowed to do this, and some say, and also you know what the penalty is, and you do it anyway, so then you're not liable to bring a sin offering. You would be liable to excision, perhaps an early death, at the hands of heaven. So we're talking about an unwitting violation of Shabbos, and it results in liability to bring a sin offering when the temple is standing. What we're going to learn in today's Mishnah is that if you begin that action unwittingly, but then in the middle of the action, you realize what's going on, you remember it's Shabbos, and you decide to do it anyway, so your unwitting action midstream becomes intentional, so then you're going to be exempt from bringing the sin offering, but presumably because at that point you'd be qualifying for that higher penalty of excision at the hands of heaven. But at any rate, for you to be liable to bring the sin offering for an unwitting violation of Shabbos, you need to be unwitting at the beginning and at the end. In other words, that the taking, the transfer, and the placing all happen while you are making an unwitting violation of Shabbos. Okay, so now the Mishnah, I'm going to read the Mishnah to you because it's short, but the language is very precise, and then in the Gemara, our sages are going to argue about this language. So here we go. One who unwittingly throws an object from one domain to another, or one who throws an object 4 cubits within the public domain, and after the object left his hand, he remembered that he is in violation of a prohibition. If another caught it, or if a dog caught it, or if it was burned, he is exempt. Similarly, if one threw a rock on Shabbos to inflict a wound on a person or an animal for which one is liable to bring a sin offering, and he remembered that he was in violation of a prohibition before the wound was inflicted, he is exempt. And let's just note at this moment, you'd be exempt from bringing a sin offering for violating Shabbos if you threw a rock at somebody and then you realize that you were doing it on Shabbos before the rock hit the person. But if you threw a rock and you hit a person and that person gets hurt, you are going to be liable to pay damages to that person for whatever kind of suffering, medical, pain and suffering, loss of work, etc. You're going to be liable for those things. What we're talking about is whether you're going to be liable to bring the sin offering for violating Shabbos. This is the principle. All who are liable to bring sin offerings are only liable if the beginning of their action and the conclusion of their action are unwitting. However, if the beginning of one's action was unwitting and the conclusion was intentional, as he became aware that he was in violation of the prohibition, or if the beginning of one's action was intentional and the conclusion was unwitting, the individuals in both of these cases are exempt unless both the beginning and the conclusion were unwitting. So I think it's a little bit easier for us to understand, he forgot it's Shabbos, he started to do this thing, and then just as he was doing it, he was in the midst of doing this forbidden action, he remembered, I can't do that. And the action ends, but it's no longer unwitting, so okay, this guy's going to be exempt because it's no longer a complete unwitting action. What's the case where somebody intends to violate Shabbos, starts the action, and somehow halfway through the action, it becomes unintentional? It's a little bit harder to imagine. We'll talk about it some more as we get into the Gemara. But when I read this Mishnah, I was reminded of a joke. So it's a classic Jewish joke. A new rabbi in a very established synagogue is leading services for the first time in the synagogue. And when the congregation, this is not during the pandemic, right? When the people are davening, praying in shul, in synagogue. So the congregation reaches the point in the service where they recite the Shema, the great declaration of God's unity, which is the fundamental cornerstone of Jewish prayer. And at that point in the prayer service, half of the people stand up, the other half remain seated. The ones who stand yell at the seated people, "You should stand up, you should stand up." And the people who are sitting down yell at the people who are standing, "You should sit down, you should sit down." Well, the new rabbi is quite flummoxed by these carryings on in the synagogue. And this happens a few more times during the daily prayers and even on Shabbos. So he says he's got to put an end to this. He doesn't understand how this has happened. He understands that some congregations have a different minhag, a different tradition on whether the Shema should be said sitting or standing. But to have people arguing with each other in the midst of service is absolutely unacceptable. So what he does is a very Jewish way to handle this. He gets one representative of the standing group and one representative of the sitting group. He becomes the third delegate, and this group of three goes to see the oldest living member of the synagogue, who's actually living in a nursing home. He's 98 years old. They come to visit this man. His name is Stan Grossman. And they say to Stan, the rabbi says, we've got a problem at the shul. Every time we get to the Shema, some people stand, others sit, and the ones who are standing yell at the seated people, and the seated people yell at the standing people. At which point the representative of the standing group says, "Yeah, come on, Stan, just tell him what like it is. Of course we stand." And Stan says, "No, that is not the tradition." And so the representative of the seated group says, you see, we're supposed to be sitting during the Shema." And Stan says, "No, that is not the tradition." And the rabbi says, "Stan, come on. We need to have a ruling on this. We can't have it that every time we get to the services, half are standing, half are seated, and everyone's yelling at each other." And Stan says, "Aha, that is the tradition." Which is to say that sometimes a thing gets going and people forgot why it got going. I mean, in this case of the synagogue, clearly when they formed the congregation, there were already people coming from other places with different traditions who never could agree. But it just happens that sometimes what we originally intended to do gets forgotten. And then, we just proceed along on the basis of what we were doing rather than whatever that original intention was. All right, let's continue. Okay, so the Gemara is going to clarify this idea that a person is unwittingly throws an object, let's say from the private domain into the public domain, and then after it leaves his hand, he remembers that it's Shabbos and that he shouldn't do it. And he remembers before the object lands. Is he going to be liable to bring the sin offering? Yes, dear? I just have to get my card. Oh, okay. Okay, let me see. It turns out that what the Mishnah is saying may not be what we think it is saying. Because it certainly sounds like the Mishnah said, he throws it, unwitting, forgot that it's Shabbos. While it's in the air, he remembers, and before it lands, now it's an intentional act because he knows, and so he's going to be exempt from bringing the sin offering. But now we're going to have an opinion that actually, no, he's liable. He's only going to be exempt if he's carrying. So he picks up the object and carries it out into the public domain. And while he's carrying and before he sets it down in the public domain, he remembers that it's Shabbos. So now that would be unintentional and then intentional. But the person who threw, as soon as it left his hand, it's no longer in his control. So at the time that it left his hand, it was unwitting, right? He was still in that state of unwittingness. That's why he threw it. He remembered while it was in the air, but in terms of the action that he took, it's already done. So that guy would be liable to bring the sin offering according to this opinion. Instead, the way that it's explained, and who brings, because I didn't write it in my notes, in terms of the bolt and the cable, the bolt and the cable, the bolt and the cord, Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana says, what's going on with this guy who threw, and it was unwitting, and in the air he remembered, and then it became intentional because he remembered, is because he threw a bolt on a cord. So picture this, it's almost like, I just picture it. So he's got a string attached to an object. The string is still in his hand. He throws the object out into the public domain. He remembers while it's in the air. He has the option of yanking the cord back. Because he doesn't yank the cord back, it's considered that it was intentional when it landed out there. And so according to Rav Kahana, that's the situation where he becomes exempt. There's a problem with this reasoning because if you throw something and it's on a cord that's still attached to your hand, anyway you're going to be exempt, because even though it lands out there and you allowed it to land in there, the fact that it's attached by this cord, according to the sages, actually means that it isn't fully placed out there in the public domain. You could pull it back, so it's essentially like it's still in flight, right? It isn't fully placed. It's as if it's suspended over there, awaiting your decision whether to pull it back or not. Presumably, if you let go of the string, that would complete the action. But it presents a difficulty for Rav Kahana. And so we have two other explanations of what the Mishnah is saying. One from Rava and one from Rav Ashi. Rava says it's the way we originally understood it. He throws it, and he unwitting that it's Shabbos. While it's in the air, he remembers. It lands out there in the public domain. He is exempt because this was unwitting at the beginning and intentional at the end. The second part of the Mishnah, or of this part of the Mishnah, according to Rava, when it says if a person caught it, or a dog caught it, or it burned up, because, for example, he threw it into a furnace, right? He threw this object and it landed in a furnace and burnt up, and so it never landed. So then Rava is saying, so that person would be exempt because it's a different teaching. This doesn't have to do with his intent. This has to do with the fact that it never landed. That's according to Rava. Rav Ashi says, now you're bringing in a whole different idea. Why would a Mishnah that is teaching intentionality and the fact that if you have to have the same intentionality at the beginning and at the end, also include a passage about the fact that it has to land, and if it didn't land because somebody caught the object or a dog caught the object or it landed in a furnace, that it wasn't complete. Rather, says Rav Ashi, this is one teaching. And what it comes to say, according to Rav Ashi, what the Mishnah is saying is a person was unwitting that it's Shabbos, forgot that it's Shabbos, or didn't know that you can't throw an object on Shabbos. He throws it from the private domain, let's say, out to the public domain. While it's in the air, he remembers that it's Shabbos and he shouldn't have done that. He would be liable because at the time that it left his hand, at the time that it left his hand, it was a complete act. It was unwitting. But this guy gets lucky. And so because, he realized while it was in the air, and then it got caught by a person or by a dog, or it landed in a furnace, so he's going to be off the hook. He's exempt because his action was unwitting when he threw it, intentional while it was in the air, and then it never really came to a landing. None of the explanations is totally satisfying, I would say, but that's our understanding of how they come through. Okay, And it is worth noting that in terms of this idea of throwing it to a dog, like if you throw something out into the public domain and a dog ends up eating it, and so it never landed, so you got lucky, right? Whether you were unwitting or intentional, the action itself was not completed unless you intended to throw it to a dog. If you were throwing it out there so a dog would catch it, you might not be sure exactly where it's going to land or where in the throw the dog is going to catch it. But since you threw it to the dog, and indeed it landed in the dog's mouth, one of those, I remember my neighbor, Mark Wallenstein, growing up, his family had an English Springer Spaniel named Freckles. And that dog was a genius at catching objects. It would jump like 8 feet in the air and snatch something, so accurately with its mouth. And so if you meant to throw it to Freckles, the dog, and he caught it, so you'd certainly be liable because the intended action was realized. And that, my friends, wraps up our discussion of Chapter 11 of Tractate Shabbos. If you have questions or comments, put them in. Nina is going to put them in front of me, and I'll come to it at the end. But right now what I want to do is do a quick discussion of the first Mishnah of Chapter 12. We're finally moving on from carrying and throwing and transferring objects from one domain to another, and minimum measures for transferring objects, etc. Now we're going to do something a little different. We're still talking about the prohibited labors of Shabbos, but here in Chapter 12, we're going to be talking about the prohibited labors of building, plowing, and writing. So I open Mishnah number 1 of Chapter 12 with building, the prohibited labor of building. Recall that all of the prohibited labors, we learned them out from the labors that were necessary to build the tabernacle when the children of Israel received the instruction at Mount Sinai, you will build a home for God in this world. It will take the form of a tabernacle, the Mishkan. It's going to be a portable structure, basically an incredibly beautiful and elaborate tent structure with several areas, the Holy of Holies, the Holy, and the courtyard, where the altar, the Mizbeach is, where the people would bring sacrifices, where the menorah, the candelabrum, would be lit on a daily basis, etc. The tabernacle in the desert. And all of the labors necessary to build it are the ones that are prohibited on Shabbos. How do we know? Because when the instruction to build the tabernacle was given, right in the midst of giving the instruction, Moses reminded the people by God's instruction that you will stop this labor for Shabbos, right? So even though we're building the holiest object ever built in the history of mankind, come Shabbos, we stop, right? And that's where we learn that these labors are prohibited on Shabbos. So building, and among the labors, in addition to carrying, we've seen weaving, harvesting, threshing, reaping, writing, sewing, tanning, skinning, all these different labors that were necessary to create that tabernacle. And then one of those categories, it seems very broad to us, is building, right? So if you imagine everything that goes into building a house, hammering and sawing and measuring, and planing and sanding and scraping and mixing stucco and applying stucco and troweling, all those things are going to be building. So they're all going to be subcategories of building. The single category, building. The question here in Mishnah number 1 of chapter 12, what is the minimum amount that if you did that much building on Shabbos, you would be liable to bring the sin offering? So again, like carrying, it would be an unwitting violation. If you, because you didn't know it was Shabbos or you didn't know that this labor was prohibited, you did some building on Shabbos, how much would you have to do in order to become liable to bring the sin offering? And the answer is any amount. Even the smallest bit of building. The only limitation or qualification of that principle in the Mishnah is that whatever you build has to last, right? It's not like just a tiny, like a totally temporary thing, but it has to last. Some say that it just lasts, and others say it has to last. You build something that would last through the Shabbos day, right, until the end of Shabbos. So if you build something that's so temporary, I guess like a house of cards. I mean, maybe a house of cards would be okay. I'm not even sure about that. For sure, Legos you don't do. You can't build Legos on Shabbos. But maybe a house of cards, which is inherently so fragile that it's just not even going to make it till the end of Shabbos, you wouldn't do that. So how minimum is this minimum? And some examples are given. That if a person who had a dirt floor in his house dug a little hole just to hide a few coins in it, that would be building, and he would be liable for the sin offering. Or, which we learn out from the labor building the Mishkan, they brought beams, right? So that there were beams that hold up the tabernacle in the desert. If a worm got into one of those wooden beams and sort of, ate out a little hole in the beam, and so they poured some hot lead into that hole. I mean, it could be just a tiny little hole, but they wanted the beams to be perfect, and so they filled that little wormhole with hot lead. That would be enough to violate Shabbos. And the other example was repairing a hole in a wall. So any little amount of building that has any kind of permanency is going to be enough to be liable for violating Shabbos. We'll just share one more point that comes up in the Gemara discussing this Mishnah of liability for building on the question of chiseling. So some different examples of things that you might do when you're building come up. Like if somebody created a utensil, a hammer, and he made a hole in the handle of the hammer or put a pin in there to hang it up. What labor would that be? Or if somebody had a chicken coop and they drilled a hole in the side of the chicken coop so that the chickens would get more air. The question is that building or is it some other labor? One who makes a hole in the wall of a chicken coop so that chickens get more air, yes, that is building. But one who chisels, right? So chiseling. So imagine, somebody takes a chisel and a hammer and knocks away some stone from a piece of stone, right? I mean, the most beautiful example, you could imagine Michelangelo working on the statue of David, right? And he's chiseling away the marble and eventually leaving that beautiful, beautiful statue of young King David. So what is chiseling? Is chiseling building? Or is it something else? You might say, well, it sounds like he's making a statue. I mean, isn't that building? On the other hand, he started with something much larger and he's removing stone from it. So is that really building or is it something else? Is it extracting? One might say, is it extracting? Like, because we know that there's a lot of different categories of labor that are prohibited on Shabbos that have to do with extracting the edible from the inedible. Chiseling does not come under that category. It's much closer related to building, but in the end, the sages say, no, it's not building. It's striking the final blow. That's one of I'm very fond of this category of prohibited labors because I just find it poetic. The idea that, if you're building a house, okay, everything that you do to build a house is called building. But when the house is done and you strike the final blow, like, I don't know, for instance, maybe the final thing so that you consider that the house is finished is installing the mezuzah, right? And so you put in the top nail and then the final hammer stroke that's going to attach the mezuzah to the door frame and the house is going to be finished is hammering in that bottom nail, striking the final blow. The top nail might be considered building, but the final nail is considered striking the final blow. Interestingly, chiseling, any chiseling, even the beginning of chiseling a stone to get it to the right shape, is considered striking the final blow. How do we know that? Because this was a disagreement between Rav and Shmuel. Rav thought it was building. Shmuel thought that chiseling is more akin to striking the final blow. Normally, when Rav and Shmuel disagree, we hold by Rav. But because Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan said that Shmuel is correct in this particular argument with Rav, the halacha follows Shmuel. It's important to understand which category a particular labor falls under, or let's say a subcategory, which category it falls under, because if somebody did multiple prohibited acts on Shabbos, if they're all building, if he hammered some wood and he sawed some wood and he troweled some stucco, all of those things would be building. If he did them all in one lapse of awareness on Shabbos, he would only be liable to bring one sin offering. But if he did labors that fall into two categories, like he sawed some wood and he hammered some wood and he laid some stucco, those are all one sin offering. But if he also chiseled some stone, that would fall under striking the final blow, and now he would be liable to bring two sin offerings. So I understand that the halacha follows Shmuel in this case because these later Amoraim, these later sages, Yehoshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan, agreed with Shmuel, and that's why we follow. But in terms of the reasoning, I'm not sure. It's not given here what the reasoning is on this daf. So just me, Sal Litvak, who's not a rabbi, and thinking aloud, this is not dispositive at all. Perhaps later in our journey through the Talmud, we'll discover what is the reasoning why chiseling constitutes striking the final blow. My guess, just my guess, is chiseling is striking the final blow because, first of all, it is striking a blow. And second, if you walked away, if you decide, oh, I've chiseled enough. So at any point, you might stop chiseling, and then the last blow you struck would be the final blow. And so that's why chiseling is striking the final blow. At any point, you could abandon it. I guess you could say, well, yeah, but that would apply to any nail that you hammer in the house when you're building the house. Why wouldn't that apply to every nail? And I guess because the house clearly needs to be built, it's not going to be finished until it's built. But a stone that you're chiseling away, at any moment, it could be a stone that was needed to build a wall, right? Stones of any shape and size could potentially be used in a wall. And so if you're chiseling and you pause, right then and there, that stone could be used in some wall, right? And in this daf, we also learn that there's sort of three types of stones that are, or three actions that are possible when one is building a stone wall. There's the bottom layer where you just lay them in the dirt, and that's considered building. There's the middle layer where you would have to apply some mortar first, then put the stone, then put some more mortar on, and there's the top layer where you just lay the stone on top of mortar. So depending what row you're working in, would determine, if you laid a stone on the middle row but didn't add mortar first, so that wouldn't be an active building. You wouldn't have done anything. It's like you just put the stone down for a moment. But if you just put the stone down on the ground in a place where it was going to be the bottom row, so that would be an active building. That's why it matters what is the context. Okay, that is what I've got for us today. Let me check your comments and questions. Irene Blaywase says, I don't understand why someone who is completely unwitting is liable, but someone who is half intentional is exempt. Shouldn't someone who doesn't intend something be dealt with more harshly? And the answer is, Irene, he is dealt with more harshly. Being liable to bring the sin offering, remember, is for an unwitting violation. One who does something intentionally, he's exempt from bringing a sin offering, and that's too bad for him because he doesn't have the opportunity to get an atonement, to complete his atonement by bringing that sin offering. Instead, he's subject to a higher level of punishment. It's just dealt with by heaven, right? So this is an act of faith. You have to follow that whenever we do intentional sins, there's an account, right? There is an account, and there is an account keeper in heaven. God sees everything that we do and keeps track. And there is a book with all of our deeds written in it, and both our good deeds and our bad deeds. These bad deeds, which end up unatoned for by bringing the sin offering, can start to weigh on us and can ultimately result in punishment, and we are confident that all deeds will be accounted for. Today, where we don't have a temple, and we have lost the opportunity to bring a sin offering to atone for our unwitting sins, okay, so now we rely on prayer. And this is why when we say the Tachanun prayer on a daily basis, not every day, there are some celebratory days when we don't recite Tachanun, but in most days, we say, very similar to the confession that we make at Yom Kippur, I have sinned, and I throw myself on your mercy. Please forgive me for my unwitting sins and my intentional sins. When we don't have the possibility of bringing sin offerings, so we pray even harder, and prayer has really taken the place of bringing offerings in the temple, and prayer is very important. In addition to prayer, the other two legs of that three-legged stool are tzedakah, giving to charity, giving to righteous causes, and teshuva, organizing yourself to make that atonement. And so when that opportunity to commit the same sin again comes up, we will have grown and not do it again. Bill Eldridge says, hello from the graduate theological something. I forget, right? I forget what you said it was called, but it's a theological program at Berkeley. Question, why would he be liable at all when he only remembers when it's in the air and far from him? Clearly, it's now beyond his agency. Yes, and I think that's why the Amoraim in the Gemara were uncomfortable with this idea, and why they came up with these alternate scenarios that, well, actually what was meant was the bolt on a cord, right? That he threw an object attached to a string. He had the option to stop it in its flight, and he doesn't. Or better, this really only applies to somebody who is carrying. The Mishnah wrote throwing, but really it applies better to carrying. That was another way. Or what Rav Ashi said, he threw it, he remembered, and he's like, oh no, and then he got lucky, and the thing never landed. Somebody caught it for him, somebody stopped it for him, a dog caught it in the air, it landed in a furnace and burnt up. He got lucky. But as we can see, the sages were uncomfortable with this idea. The principle is sound, and that's why the second half of the Mishnah would certainly apply to one who is carrying, that both the beginning and the ending of his carrying would have to be unwitting in order for him to qualify to bring the sin offering to atone for his unwitting transgression. Christo Cheney, I remember this joke, told it at my synagogue one of the last times I led services before the pandemic began. That's no, that is not the tradition joke about the Shema. If you're joining us late, you'll want to rewind. I told that shortly after, near the beginning of the class after discussing the Mishnah. Brian of Bloomfeld, as an example of going from intentional to not intentional, if I intend to throw a frisbee outside an Eruv, but a gust of wind turns it and it lands in the Eruv, I am exempt. So this is where, so in terms of intentionality, it's more like awareness that what you're doing is a sin. The case that you've named is a good one, but we had it the other day, right? That you throw something, your intent is to do something which is a transgression, but you got lucky that Hashem steps in and sends a big wind and it blows it back before it lands. So the ruling there was, if it lands even for a moment, in a place where the transgression would be complete, like, it landed on the ground, in the public domain more than 4 cubits away, or you start in private domain, or in your case, what you're saying outside the Eruv. So if it lands, you're liable. But if it never lands or never comes within 3 handbreadths of the ground, that's the principle of lavud, that if something is within 3 handbreadths, it's considered attached to the ground. It's as if it came down and landed. But if it was just up in the air and it came back, so then you would be exempt. You got lucky, right? The wind helped you out. There's a discussion about if you can play fetch with your dog at a dog park. If it's fenced, Is that a private domain? I would have to say that if there's a fence that is more than 10 tefachim high, 10 handbreadths high, and it fully encloses the dog park, it sounds like a private domain. It sounds like a separate domain. What you couldn't do is throw a ball from outside, like in the rest of the park, into the dog park that's fenced. But once you're in the dog park, sounds like you could throw something within that private domain. You should ask a rabbi to be sure. Don't rely on that. But from what we've learned so far and what I remember, unless I'm making a mistake, which is possible, but it seems to me, yes, you could throw the ball within the private domain of the park. At least in terms of liability to bring the sin offering. What we're not sure about is there a rabbinic decree saying that you shouldn't do that? You wouldn't qualify for the sin offering. You wouldn't have violated the Torah prohibition on Shabbos, but it may be that the rabbis would say that's not Shabbistic, right? It's not in keeping with Shabbos, so maybe you shouldn't do that. So I'm not sure if it's fully permitted, but it certainly sounds to me like you wouldn't be violating a Torah prohibition. And finally, Yehudis Fishman says, I think the original term of makeh bepatish continues al hasidan, which is like a blacksmith does with a patch, like making a horseshoe rather than banging a nail in. So Yehudis is talking about striking the final blow, right? And she's talking about crafting a utensil. So like when a blacksmith makes a utensil, that's where it really makes sense, right? Striking the final blow, okay, I get it, right? It's a blacksmith, he's making a sword or he's making a horseshoe, he's making an iron utensil. He strikes the final blow on the anvil, of the object on the anvil, and now it's done. Okay, that sounds like the classic case of striking the final blow. And the question is, why is chiseling away stone also considered striking the final blow? Tomorrow, I'm pretty sure it's tomorrow, we're going to discuss what happens, is there liability if you strike a hammer on an anvil and there's nothing there? Are you going to be liable for just striking a hammer on an anvil, even though you're not hammering some, red hot iron into shape? We'll discuss that tomorrow. That's what I've got for us today. May you all be blessed. I gave out blessings last week on my Hebrew birthday, where the tradition really is that we give out brachas. Today's my solar birthday, according to the calendar that most people in the culture use, the Gregorian solar calendar. And I mentioned at the beginning that we delivered care packages to frontline responders. So I still want to give everybody a bracha today. May you live to 120 and enjoy all the blessings that life can offer you of health, of meaning, of joy, of prosperity, and especially, may you be a blessing to all the people in your life. Sending you all lots of love, all the best, my holy sisters and